Please, don't go to work, mommy. Awful rumors permeated Moscow, Russia in October 1993. Many whispered to each other that there were snipers on roofs throughout the capital. Yes, that was when children learned that snipers weren't only in the movies, but in real life too. Some of them were absolutely terrified that their parents would get shot, rather than enjoying the fact that their school was canceled. And the reason it was canceled was the Russian constitutional crisis of 1993, also known as the Black October. The crisis culminated on October 4th, 1993. That day, the first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, ordered tanks from the army that was loyal to him to open fire on the parliamentary building known as the Russian White House. There was fighting happening in other parts of the capital too. For example, the Ostankino television tower. Yeltsin sought to crush protesters and their leaders who opposed his September 21st reform. The reform effectively took power away from the parliamentarians as well as the Supreme Council of the Russian Federation. Seeing rows of tanks heading towards the city center was not really new for Moscow children. Only 2 years earlier, in August, they witnessed rows and rows of heavy machinery heading in the same direction towards Moscow center in what became known as the August coup d'etat against the Soviet Union's last president, Mikhail Gorbachev. Many believed that his reforms were on the way to destroying the Soviet Union. And they did. Russia's President Vladimir Putin once described the dissolution of the Soviet Union as, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, end quote. While the quote may seem a bit exaggerated, if you actually look at the statistics, it ends up making sense. The complete and total death toll is very difficult to estimate. But, for example, prior to the war in Donbass, then eastern Ukraine, that began in 2014, the direct deaths from armed conflicts in Russia and the former Soviet Union after 1991 were estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 600,000 people, and that is just armed conflict.
It is a momentous and historic and a very sad day in Moscow as the huge Russian parliament building known as the White House remains under a siege and occasional attack by Boris Yeltsin's government troops, still attempting to dislodge the 100 or so renegade parliamentarians, their defenders, and others still inside the building. A great deal of damage has been done to the building. Steve Hurst and Eileen O'Connor, although the fighting has been confined to, as you've noted, a relatively small area, that area has been heavily damaged, hasn't it?
It certainly has. The White House itself has been very heavily damaged. There's a fire still raging on the 6th floor of that building. The defenders of the White House had said that they had put out that fire, but it apparently has at least restarted. We can see lots of flames and now smoke coming from offices that previously were not on fire. The building itself was hit many times by armored personnel carriers from Boris Yeltsin's troops firing upon the building, and also from tank fire on the back of the building. Not within our eyesight or camera range is a bunker around which clearly there was a heavy gunfight early this morning. We haven't heard a lot of firing from there. That was the bunker from which the White House had stored most of its weapons and ammunition. But a lot of those weapons and ammunitions clearly were carried to within the White House last night. Every time the defenders of the White House thought they might be under attack, they did used to bring those weapons into the White House. They have automatic weapons. They have rocket-propelled, shoulder-launched grenades. They have claimed that they had surface-to-air missiles. We don't know. In Russia these days, it's very easy to buy heavy weaponry. anything you want to buy, you can buy. Steve?
Indeed you can, and a lot of the horrible conflicts that are going on around the perimeter of the former Soviet Union are very much fueled by that weapons trade. The Russian army, though showing solidarity here today, has become a virtual peddler of arms. The men in outlying regions of the former Soviet Union selling arms simply to get some money to feed themselves and buy some cigarettes. Here's some gunfire again from the back of the White House, Bob.
Are you saying, Steve, that even civilians in Moscow and in Russia can buy this weaponry?
Absolutely. There is a burgeoning, what we call here mafia. It's just organized criminals, and they are all heavily armed, many of them with these AK-47 assault rifles. The city itself has become pretty much an armed camp. And in some circles, you can hear some more gunfire from the back of the White House building.
If we were to use broader criteria and look at these statistics and include in them demographic decline, the rise in abortions, deaths from treatable illnesses, shorter life expectancy, immigration abroad, alcohol and narcotics abuse, etc., even starvation, and the rise in crime, all those things that neoliberal capitalism brought to the region, then the total number of deaths would be in the millions, in many millions. But the dissolution of the Soviet Union, an act voted against by the majority of the residents of the Soviet Union, is beyond the scope of this particular video. This time around, in 1993, many pundits, ordinary Russians, and even the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation qualified Boris Yeltsin's actions as a coup d'etat, regime change, in Russia. As a result, the Supreme Court voted to impeach Yeltsin and remove him from power. This is how Vice President Alexander Rutskoy became the temporary acting head of state. The events between late September and October 4th, 1993 culminated in a bloodbath in Moscow, with the death toll estimated at around 200 people, with another 1,000 or so wounded and injured.
80 tank, and just the curious people of Moscow, not apparently impassioned or angry by the events that are transpiring before them, but curious, looking on as bystanders would in other situations look at a car accident.
CNN eagerly reported on Yeltsin massacre as Russian TV channels were temporarily silent. Swan Lake, anyone? Of course, one of the reasons they were silent is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Ostankino TV tower was also one of the sites of protest and shooting at the protesters. Remember, making oneself a quasi-dictator and pushing devastating quote-unquote reforms are only bad when they're carried out by those who are outside of the so-called rules-based order. In Yeltsin's case, he was the proverbial son of a bitch of the official West, as the saying goes. So it was totally hunky-dory that he was doing all this stuff. In the end, Yeltsin won. He consolidated his power, he formed the Federal Assembly, and he adopted his constitution. And on top of that, of course, he imprisoned the leaders of the protest, such as the aforementioned Rutskoy, as well as Ruslan Khasbulatov. He was the chairman of the Supreme Council of the Russian Federation. Later, these leaders were amnestied. So why? Why did Yeltsin target parliamentarians and in fact dissolve the parliament, for which he was then impeached? Well, he himself noted that they stood in the way of his economic reforms. These neoliberal reforms translated into bona fide hell for the average Russians in the 1990s. We've already covered the topic of Russian privatization on this channel, but let's just look at a few statistics from this period. Mass-scale privatizations of people's wealth, of factories, of oil, gas, minerals, machinery, on, were sold off to a handful of oligarchs and foreigners. Russia defaulted. Clinton-era Americans like Jeffrey Sachs and think tanks like the Harvard Institute for International Development advising Russians, as some convincingly show, to deliberately destroy Russia's economy were some of the consequences of Yeltsin's reforms. And it's not like these dismal results couldn't have been foreseen. For example, if you look at the Yeltsin-era shock therapy initiative that was aimed at introducing neoliberal capitalism by, among other things, removing price controls and subsidies, and essentially leading to hyperinflation of 2,500%, that is 2,500% for those of you that don't speak American English. This was launched in 1992 by Yegor Gaidar, prior to the Black October of 1993, the topic of this video. Isabella Weber, in her book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, published in 2021, wrote, quote, "As a result of shock therapy, Russia experienced a rise in mortality beyond that of any previous peacetime experiences of an industrialized country," end quote. So even Western academics note how shocking and devastating the end result of the 1990s so-called reforms were on average Russians. The meaning and impact of Black October 1993 are still being hotly debated. One thing is for certain. The constitutional crisis of 1993 served as a major watershed moment for those Russians who were initially supportive of these neoliberal capitalist reforms, quote unquote, leading to their major disillusionment. Other Russians were skeptical of these reforms from the very beginning. Yet this event was one of many that began during Gorbachev's perestroika of the late 1980s, which of course was very much cheered on by the West. From that period onward, existent economy and way of life were literally being ripped apart, in part perhaps due to the naive attitudes of the late Soviet leadership, but in part I would say it was deliberate. These reforms exacerbated the socio-economic and political contradictions of late Soviet/early post-Soviet Russia. They highlighted the gap between the rich and the poor in Russia, which was much more substantial than that of the Soviet Union, even including the party leadership. It is no wonder that Boris Yeltsin, the first Russian president in the modern Russian period, is considered to be one of the most despised individuals in all of Russia's history.